In the annals of American history, no period is more synonymous with audacious ambition, unimaginable wealth, and profound societal transformation than the Gilded Age. It was an era forged in the crucible of the Civil War's aftermath, a time when the very soul of the nation was being reshaped by the twin forces of industrialization and innovation. From the ashes of conflict, a new American aristocracy arose, a pantheon of families whose names would become etched into the very fabric of the nation's identity: the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, and the Ponts. These were not the landed gentry of old Europe, but a new breed of royalty, their power derived not from inherited titles, but from the raw, untamed forces of capitalism. They were the architects of modern America, their visions and ventures connecting a sprawling continent with ribbons of steel, illuminating cities with the magic of electricity, and building commercial empires that stretched across the globe. Their lives were a study in contrasts, a tapestry of glittering opulence and ruthless ambition, of breathtaking philanthropy and bitter personal rivalries. This is the story of these 6 families, of the men and women who built and sustained them, and of the enduring legacies they left behind. It is a journey into the heart of the Gilded Age, an exploration of the American dream in its most extravagant and untamed form, and a reflection on the timeless themes of power, legacy, and the ever-shifting sands of fortune. The saga of the Vanderbilt dynasty, America's first great industrial family, does not commence in a marble-clad ballroom or a wood-paneled boardroom, but on the choppy, wind-swept waters of New York Harbor. Its patriarch, Cornelius Vanderbilt, born in 1794, was a man carved from the rugged timber of early America. He was a force of nature, a figure whose raw, untamed ambition and profane, pugnacious spirit would come to define the very essence of the Gilded Age tycoon. His lineage was humble, Dutch farmers who had settled on Staten Island generations before. His father was a feckless farmer and boatman, his mother, Phoebe Hand, a woman of formidable character and thrift. It was from her that Cornelius inherited his drive and his initial stake in the world. He was a boy with little appetite for schooling. He was functionally illiterate his entire life, but possessed an almost preternatural understanding of commerce and competition. The salt spray of the harbor was his classroom, the cacophony of the docks his lecture hall. At the tender age of 16, seeing opportunity where others saw only toil, he famously convinced his mother to lend him $100. The loan came with a condition. He had to single-handedly clear and plant a rocky 8-acre field. He accomplished the seemingly impossible task by rallying a group of local boys, promising them a ride on his future boat. With the money secured, he purchased a periauger, a small, 2-masted, flat-bottomed sailboat, and established a passenger and freight ferry service between Staten Island and the bustling wharves of Manhattan. This was not a genteel enterprise. The harbor was a brutal arena, a lawless space where rival boatmen physically fought for fares. The young Cornelius, tall and powerfully built, was more than capable of holding his own. He worked from dawn until dusk, underbidding competitors, earning a reputation for reliability, and quickly garnering the nickname that would follow him for life, the Commodore. The War of 1812 proved to be his first significant windfall. He secured a lucrative government contract to supply the forts garrisoned around New York City, a task he performed with such efficiency that he began to accumulate his first real capital, a small war chest for the larger battles to come. As the 19th century progressed, the hiss of the steam engine began to drown out the whisper of the sail. Vanderbilt, with his uncanny foresight, saw that steam was the future of transport. He sold his sailing fleet and threw himself headlong into the world of steamboats. Here he encountered his first formidable obstacle, the powerful state-sanctioned monopoly on steamboat traffic in New York, waters held by Robert Fulton and the politically connected Robert Livingston. Any other man would have been deterred. Vanderbilt, however, viewed the monopoly not as a barrier, but as an opportunity for creative destruction. He brazenly challenged it, running a steamboat service to New Jersey under a banner that read, "New Gibbons for the People." When his rivals sued, he hired the brilliant lawyer Daniel Webster and took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. The resulting 1824 landmark decision in Gibbons versus Ogden shattered the monopoly, opening the nation's waterways to free competition and establishing the federal government's supremacy over interstate commerce. For Vanderbilt, it was a personal and financial triumph, cementing his reputation as a giant killer. The subsequent decades were marked by a series of relentless steamboat wars. On the Hudson River, along the Long Island Sound, and down the eastern seaboard, Vanderbilt deployed his signature tactic. He would enter a market, slash fares to unsustainable levels, and drive his competitors to the brink of bankruptcy, at which point he would either buy them out for pennies on the dollar or accept a handsome payment to take his fighting ships elsewhere. His ambition was not confined to the East Coast. The California gold rush of 1849 ignited a mass migration, and the Commodore saw a chance to dominate it. While his rivals focused on the arduous route across the Isthmus of Panama, Vanderbilt charted a bolder course. He established the Accessory Transit Company, a shortcut across Nicaragua that involved a perilous journey up the San Juan River and across Lake Nicaragua. It was faster, cheaper, and for a time, immensely profitable, earning him over $1 million a year. It was also a venture that revealed the darker side of his character. When two of his former associates, Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison, conspired to steal the company from him while he was on vacation, Vanderbilt's response was legendary. He famously penned a letter to them that read, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow, I'll ruin you." And he did. He started a competing line, drove down prices, and within 2 years forced his betrayers into financial oblivion. It was a stark lesson in the consequences of crossing the Commodore. By the 1860s, Vanderbilt, now approaching his 70th birthday, was already one of the richest men in America. He could have retired to a life of ease, but his restless energy and insatiable appetite for conquest drove him toward a new frontier, the railroads. With the same ruthless efficiency he had applied to shipping, he began to systematically acquire and consolidate the fragmented and inefficient railway lines that crisscrossed the Northeast. He started with the New York and Harlem Railroad, a struggling line that his competitors derisively called the Little Harlem. In a masterful display of stock market manipulation, he quietly bought up shares, then watched as his rivals, including the infamous Daniel Drew, attempted to short the stock, betting on its collapse. Vanderbilt, however, had secretly cornered the market. When the short sellers tried to buy back shares to cover their positions, they found that the Commodore owned them all, forcing them to settle at an exorbitant price. He repeated this strategy with the Hudson River Railroad and then, in a stunning coup, seized control of the mighty New York Central, merging the lines to create a seamless transportation artery from the Great Lakes to the port of New York. His railroad empire was not merely an asset on a balance sheet, it was a physical manifestation of his power. To house its operations, he ordered the construction of a monument to his dominance, the original Grand Central Depot, a colossal train shed of iron and glass that stood as the gateway to the nation's most important city. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he left a staggering fortune of over $100 million, more than the entire U.S. Treasury at the time, almost all of it to his favored son, William Henry. William Henry Vanderbilt, a man his father had once dismissed as a blatherskite, proved to be a surprisingly adept businessman. He doubled the family fortune within a decade, consolidating the railroad empire and famously uttering the phrase that would forever be associated with the unbridled arrogance of the Gilded Age elite. When asked about the public good, he reportedly snapped, "The public be damned." But William Henry's stewardship was the final chapter of the family's empire building. The generations that followed were defined not by their creation of wealth, but by its spectacular dispersal. The Gilded Age entered its most extravagant phase, and the Vanderbilts became its most ostentatious practitioners. They embarked on an architectural arms race, a frenzy of construction that transformed Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and the seaside cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, into a fantasy land of Beaux-Arts palaces. William K. Vanderbilt and his socially ambitious wife, Alva, commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to build the Petit Chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue and the breathtaking Marble House in Newport, a summer cottage inspired by the Petit Trianon at Versailles, built at a cost of $11 million. Not to be outdone, his brother Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that remains the grandest of the Newport mansions. These homes were not merely residences. They were theaters for a life of performative luxury, stages for masquerade balls, $1,000 dinners, and social rituals designed to solidify their status as America's unofficial royal family. Alva Vanderbilt's legendary 1883 costume ball, a party so lavish it is credited with finally forcing the gatekeeper of New York society, Mrs. Caroline Astor, to formally recognize the Vanderbilts, was the apotheosis of this social campaign. The family also married into the European aristocracy, trading American dollars for noble titles in the era of the dollar princesses, most famously when Alva forced her daughter Consuelo into a loveless marriage with the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The most thoughtful of the third generation was George Washington Vanderbilt II, a scholarly and introverted man who used his inheritance to create a different kind of monument. In the mountains of North Carolina, he amassed 125,000 acres of land and built the Biltmore Estate, a 250-room French Renaissance-style chateau that remains the largest privately owned house in the United States. He envisioned it not just as a home, but as a self-sustaining estate with pioneering forestry and agricultural programs. Yet, even this grand project was a drain on the family's resources. The relentless spending, combined with the dilution of the fortune as it was divided among numerous heirs, the introduction of income and estate taxes, and a general disinterest in the gritty work of commerce, signaled the dynasty's decline. Within a few decades, the gilded facade began to crack. By the mid-20th century, the great Fifth Avenue mansions were demolished one by one to make way for office buildings and department stores. Many of the Newport cottages were sold or turned over to preservation societies. At a reunion of 120 Vanderbilt descendants at Vanderbilt University in 1973, it was found that not a single one was a millionaire. Today, the Vanderbilt name no longer commands the financial world. The family's legacy is carried on by descendants like journalist Anderson Cooper, son of Gloria Vanderbilt, who have built their own successful careers. The enduring legacy of the Vanderbilts is not in stocks or bonds, but in stone, steel, and memory. It resides in the Grand Hall of Grand Central Terminal, in the opulent rooms of the Breakers, in the sprawling beauty of the Biltmore Estate, and in the very idea of an American aristocracy built on audacity and ambition. The story of the Vanderbilts is the archetypal American saga of dynastic wealth, a meteoric rise fueled by a singular titanic ambition, a golden age of unparalleled splendor, and a long, slow, elegant decline into history, a powerful testament to the truth that in America, even the greatest fortunes are built on shifting sands. In the gilded tapestry of American industrial power, if the Vanderbilts represented the swashbuckling, speculative spirit of the age, the Rockefellers embodied its colder, more methodical, and ultimately more revolutionary genius. Theirs was a dynasty built not on the chaotic dynamism of the open market, but on its systematic and relentless suppression. The family patriarch, John Davison Rockefeller, was the antithesis of the bombastic Commodore Vanderbilt. He was a man of quiet demeanor, impeccable composure, and profound religious conviction, a figure whose name would become a byword for both the perceived evils of monopoly and the transformative potential of strategic, large-scale philanthropy. Born in 1839 in rural Richford, New York, John D. Rockefeller's childhood was a masterclass in duality. His father, William Avery Big Bill Rockefeller, was a peripatetic conman, a charming but amoral figure who roamed the countryside as a botanic physician, peddling miracle elixirs. A bigamist and a philanderer, Big Bill openly bragged, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." He would lend his sons money at exorbitant interest and demand it back at unexpected times, instilling in them a deep-seated caution and a respect for the power of capital. In stark contrast, his mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was a devout Baptist, a woman of stern piety and unwavering discipline. From her, John D. inherited his frugality, his work ethic, and a core belief drilled into him from his earliest years that his life was part of a divine plan, and that any wealth he accumulated was a sacred trust from God to be used for the betterment of humanity. This tension between his father's cunning amorality and his mother's pious discipline would forge the complex character of the man who would come to dominate the world's most vital new commodity, oil. The family's move to the burgeoning city of Cleveland, Ohio, in 1853 placed the young Rockefeller at the epicenter of a new industrial frontier. After excelling in a commercial course, at age 16, he secured his first job as an assistant bookkeeper at the commission firm of Hewitt and Tuttle. He revered this day, September 26, 1855, as Job Day, celebrating it annually for the rest of his life with more reverence than his own birthday. It was here that his innate talent for order and numbers flourished. He was obsessed with precision, famously scrutinizing every entry in the company's ledgers. He also began his own detailed account book, Ledger A, a small red notebook in which he meticulously recorded every cent he earned and spent, noting his first charitable donations from his very first paycheck. This ledger was the embryonic form of the vast, complex accounting systems that would later allow him to control a global empire. By age 20, his legendary thrift and the business acumen he had honed allowed him to partner with Morris B. Clark in their own commission business. The venture prospered, particularly with the outbreak of the Civil War, but Rockefeller's gaze was fixed on a different horizon. In 1859, Edwin Drake had struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, unleashing a black gold rush characterized by wild speculation, chaotic production, and immense waste. While others saw a gamble, Rockefeller, with his orderly mind, saw a system waiting to be imposed. He understood that the real, lasting power lay not in the risky business of drilling for oil, but in the crucial, centralized stage of refining it. In 1863, Rockefeller and his partners entered the refining business. His refinery was a model of efficiency. He famously remarked, "I shall never forget how hungry I was in those days. I ran up and down the tops of the freight cars. I hurried up the men who were building the works." He plowed profits back into the business, abhorred debt, and obsessed over cost saving. He found a use for every byproduct of the refining process, turning waste into wealth. paraffin wax for candles, petroleum jelly, and even the sulfuric acid used in refining were sold for a profit. By 1870, he was ready to execute his grand vision. He incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with himself, his brother William, Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, and Stephen Harkness as partners. The name itself was a statement of purpose. Their kerosene would be the standard of quality and safety. What followed was one of the most swift and ruthless campaigns of industrial consolidation in history. Rockefeller's strategy, later dubbed the Cleveland Massacre, was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. He secretly negotiated a deal with the major railroads, most notably the Lake Shore and Southern Michigan Railway, for substantial rebates on his shipping costs and even drawbacks, a share of the freight charges paid by his competitors. Armed with this insurmountable advantage, he approached the other 26 refiners in Cleveland and gave them an ultimatum: sell to Standard Oil or be driven out of business. Within 6 weeks in 1872, 22 of them had capitulated. This was the blueprint for Standard Oil's continental conquest. The company expanded horizontally, absorbing or crushing rivals across the nation, and vertically acquiring its own pipelines, tank cars, barrel-making plants, and global marketing operations. To circumvent state laws that limited the size of corporations, Rockefeller and his legal team, led by Samuel C.T. Dodd, devised a brilliant and controversial new corporate structure, the Trust. In 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formed, a single entity that held the stock of 41 different companies, allowing a small board of trustees, headed by Rockefeller, to coordinate the operations of a vast integrated monopoly. By the 1890s, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of the oil refined in the United States. It dictated prices, controlled transportation, and wielded immense political influence. It was the world's first and greatest multinational corporation, a marvel of efficiency and a symbol of unchecked power. This dominance, however, came at a cost to the company's public image. Muckraking journalists, most notably Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined by Standard Oil, exposed the company's predatory tactics in her scathing 1904 exposé, The History of the Standard Oil Company. Rockefeller was cast as the ultimate robber baron, a greedy, soulless monopolist who crushed the American dream for his own gain. Public outcry and political pressure mounted, culminating in the landmark 1911 Supreme Court decision that found Standard Oil in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered its dissolution into 34 separate companies. Ironically, the breakup made Rockefeller far richer. As the sole owner of a substantial portion of the stock in each of the new independent companies, which would become giants like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, the value of his holdings soared, making him the world's first billionaire, with a fortune estimated at nearly 2% of the entire American economy. Even as he was being vilified in the press, Rockefeller was embarking on the second and arguably more influential phase of his life, the systematic and scientific dispersal of his immense wealth. This was no mere act of late-life atonement. Guided by his Baptist faith and the counsel of his key advisor, Frederick T. Gates, Rockefeller approached philanthropy with the same ambition, rigor, and strategic vision he had applied to business. He sought to create a new paradigm of giving, moving away from simple charity toward what he called the business of benevolence. He aimed to address the root causes of society's ills, not just their symptoms. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, which became a powerhouse of biomedical discovery, supporting research that led to the identification of DNA as the carrier of genetic information and the development of treatments for diseases like meningitis and yellow fever. In 1902, He established the General Education Board, an organization that invested over $325 million to transform public education, particularly in the rural and underserved South, and was instrumental in the fight against hookworm disease, which plagued millions. His crowning achievement was the Rockefeller Foundation, chartered in 1913 with the audacious mission to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The foundation became a global force, funding public health campaigns, agricultural revolutions, and scientific research on an unprecedented scale. Rockefeller himself, in his later years, cultivated a public image of a gentle, golf-playing grandfather, famous for handing out shiny new dimes to children. He lived to the age of 97, meticulously managing his philanthropic empire until the very end. The monumental task of carrying on this legacy fell to his only son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Jr. was a man haunted by his father's reputation, driven by a deep sense of moral duty to use the family fortune for public good. He oversaw the expansion of the family's philanthropic work, but also became a builder and a preservationist. After the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, a brutal crackdown on striking miners at a Colorado coal mine owned by the family, Jr. became a pioneer in the field of industrial relations, seeking to bridge the gap between labor and capital. His most visible legacy is etched into the skyline of New York City. Rockefeller Center, a massive Art Deco complex built during the Great Depression, a symbol of hope and a testament to his civic vision. He also funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, purchased vast tracts of land that would become national parks like Grand Teton and Acadia, and donated the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York. Unlike the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers institutionalized their fortune. Jr. established a complex system of trusts in 1934, designed to manage the wealth and fund the family's philanthropic endeavors for generations, successfully shielding it from the dissipation that plagued other Gilded Age dynasties. The Rockefeller family's influence persisted through the 20th century and continues today, albeit in a more diffuse form. Jr.'s 5 sons, the brothers, became prominent figures in their own right. Nelson as governor of New York and vice president of the United States, David as the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and a global statesman, Winthrop as governor of Arkansas, Lawrence as a conservationist and venture capitalist, and John D. III as a leading philanthropist. Today, the family's wealth is spread among more than 70 heirs, and their influence is exercised not through a single monopoly, but through a vast network of foundations, financial institutions, and cultural organizations. The Rockefeller name is no longer synonymous with ruthless monopoly, but with world-changing philanthropy, environmental conservation, and civic responsibility. The story of the Rockefellers is a profound narrative of transformation, of a family that first mastered the machinery of industrial capitalism and then, with equal ambition, repurposed its vast profits to reshape the very fabric of modern medicine, education, and global public life, leaving a legacy far more enduring than oil itself. In the pantheon of Gilded Age titans, one figure stands alone, not for the dynastic line he created, but for the revolutionary philosophy with which he dismantled his own fortune. Andrew Carnegie was a man of dazzling contradictions, a ruthless industrialist who crushed labor unions with brutal finality, and a benevolent visionary who championed world peace and endowed the tools of knowledge for millions. His story is not one of a family empire passed through generations, but of a singular explosive ascent from abject poverty to unimaginable wealth, followed by an equally determined history-making campaign to give it all away. It is the ultimate American rags-to-riches saga, a tale forged in the fires of the steel mill and consecrated in the hushed halls of the public library. The story begins not in America, but in the ancient town of Dunfermline, Scotland, the historic capital of Scottish kings. Born in 1835, Andrew Carnegie was the son of a skilled handloom weaver, a proud member of a trade with a long and noble history. But the Industrial Revolution, which would later make Carnegie a king in his own right, first made his family paupers. The advent of steam-powered looms rendered his father's craft obsolete, plunging the family into destitution. The Carnegies were also radicals, Chartists who believed in democratic reform and the rights of the working man, an irony that would shadow Andrew's entire life. Facing starvation, the family made the desperate decision to emigrate, borrowing money to book passage to the promised land of America. In 1848, the 13-year-old Andrew arrived with his family in the smoke-choked, cacophonous industrial slum of Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh. The promised land looked and smelled like hell. Carnegie's formal education was over. His real education was about to begin in the crucible of American industry. His first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, working a grueling 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a meager wage of $1.20. He was small for his age, and the work was terrifying. He later recalled his fear of the monstrous machinery and the drudgery of his task. Yet, even in these bleak surroundings, his ambition burned bright. He quickly moved to a job tending a steam engine and boiler, a lonely, dark, and dangerous post in the cellar of a bobbin factory. It was a descent into the inferno, but for Carnegie, it was a step up. His break came when he secured a position as a telegraph messenger boy. This job was his university. With a photographic memory and an insatiable curiosity, he not only learned the streets of Pittsburgh, but also the names of its most important businessmen. He made it a point to know who they were, what they did, and to deliver their messages with such speed and professionalism that they began to take notice of the small, energetic Scottish boy. He taught himself to decipher the telegraph's clicks by ear, a rare skill that quickly earned him a promotion to operator. His diligence and talent caught the eye of one of the most powerful men in Pittsburgh, Thomas A. Scott, a superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott hired Carnegie as his personal telegrapher and private secretary. This was the pivotal relationship of Carnegie's early life. Scott became his mentor, a second father, teaching him the intricate languages of management, finance, and investment. The railroad was the nervous system of the expanding American economy, and from his perch beside Scott, Carnegie had a front-row seat to its operations. Scott encouraged his protégé to invest. With his mother mortgaging their home to raise the $500, Carnegie made his first investment in Adams Express Company stock. Soon after, an inventor named T.T. Woodruff offered Carnegie a stake in his new venture, a railroad sleeping car. Seeing its potential, Carnegie borrowed the money from a local banker and secured a contract for Woodruff with the Pennsylvania Railroad. The dividends began to pour in, and Carnegie famously noted, "I was a capitalist, and my fortune was presently rolling in." He was still earning a modest salary, but his investments, particularly in the burgeoning oil fields of Pennsylvania, were making him a wealthy man. He understood a fundamental truth of the new economy. It was better to have your money work for you than to work for your money. He diversified his holdings, investing in iron mills, bridge-building companies, and locomotive works, all interconnected with his work at the railroad, creating a virtuous cycle of insider knowledge and profitable investment. By the end of the Civil War, he was a man of considerable means, ready to leave his mentor's side and become a master in his own right. After leaving the railroad, Carnegie's focus shifted from managing transportation to building the very infrastructure it relied on. He co-founded the Keystone Bridge Company, recognizing that wooden bridges were no longer sufficient for the heavy, high-speed rail traffic of the era. He championed the use of iron and later steel for bridges, building the magnificent Eads Bridge across the Mississippi River at St. Louis, a project that served as a monumental advertisement for his company's prowess. But it was a trip to England in 1872 that would set him on the path to becoming the world's greatest industrialist. There, he witnessed Henry Bessemer's revolutionary process for converting huge quantities of pig iron into strong, versatile steel. He saw the future. He famously cabled his partners, "The day of iron is past. Steel is king." He returned to America with a messianic zeal, determined to dominate the steel industry as Rockefeller was dominating oil. He built his first massive steel plant, the Edgar Thomson Works, in Braddock, Pennsylvania, on the banks of the Monongahela River. It was a cathedral of industry, built on a scale never before seen, designed for maximum efficiency and ruthless cost-cutting. Carnegie's genius lay not just in his adoption of new technology, but in his revolutionary business model. He pioneered vertical integration on a scale that dwarfed his competitors. He bought iron ore mines in the Mesabi Range of Minnesota, fleets of ships to carry the ore across the Great Lakes, a railroad to haul it from the ports to his mills, and vast coal and coke fields to fuel his furnaces. He controlled every single step of the manufacturing process, from raw material to finished product, insulating himself from market fluctuations and allowing him to slash his prices to levels his rivals could not match. He was obsessed with costs, famously saying, "Watch the costs and the profits will take care of themselves." He drove his workers and his managers relentlessly, fostering a culture of intense competition among his plant superintendents. But he also incentivized his top lieutenants, making men like Henry Clay Frick and Charles M. Schwab partners in the business, making them millionaires and ensuring their absolute loyalty and dedication. By the 1890s, Carnegie Steel was the largest and most profitable industrial enterprise in the world. It produced more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. Its rails bound the continent, its beams formed the skeletons of the nation's first skyscrapers, and its armor plate clad the new American Navy. Andrew Carnegie, the diminutive immigrant boy, was now the king of steel. This king, however, was a man of profound dualities. Publicly, he was a charming, optimistic intellectual, a writer of books and essays, a friend to presidents and philosophers. He cultivated an image as a progressive and a friend of the working man, even writing an essay entitled "The Rights of Labor." Yet in his business dealings he could be utterly ruthless. This contradiction came to a head in the infamous Homestead Strike of 1892. As the union contract at the Homestead Steel Plant came up for renewal, Carnegie and his chairman, the notoriously anti-union Henry Clay Frick, were determined to break the union. With Carnegie conveniently vacationing at a remote castle in Scotland, Frick took the lead. He built a fence around the plant, topped with barbed wire, which the workers called Fort Frick. He then locked the workers out and hired 300 armed Pinkerton agents to protect the non-union strikebreakers. On July 6th, the Pinkertons attempted to land from barges on the Monongahela River and were met by thousands of striking workers and their families. A bloody day-long battle ensued, leaving at least a dozen people dead. The governor of Pennsylvania sent in the state militia, the strike was broken, and the union was crushed. Carnegie's reputation as a friend of labor was shattered forever. Though he was miles away, he had given Frick his full authority, and the stain of Homestead would follow him to his grave. His relationship with Frick, once his most brilliant partner, soured and eventually ended in a bitter public feud over the price of coke, a falling out between two industrial titans that symbolized the brutal internal dynamics of the empire they had built together. Long before he reached the pinnacle of his wealth, Carnegie was already contemplating its purpose. In 1889, he published an essay in the North American Review, that would become his most enduring legacy: the gospel of wealth. In it, he laid out a radical new philosophy for the wealthy. He argued that all personal wealth beyond what was required to meet the needs of one's family was a public trust. The rich, he contended, were merely stewards of this wealth and had a moral obligation to administer it for the public good during their lifetimes. He was a fierce critic of inherited wealth, believing it to be a curse upon the children of the rich. He declared, with a conviction that shook the foundations of the Gilded Age, "The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced." In 1901, at the age of 65, he decided to put his gospel into practice. He sold Carnegie steel to the financier J.P. Morgan for the colossal sum of $480 million, the equivalent of over $300 billion today. The sale created the United States Steel Corporation, the world's first billion-dollar company. When the deal was done, Carnegie was, for a brief time, the richest man on the planet. He then retired from business and dedicated the final 2 decades of his life to the far more serious and difficult task of giving his fortune away. His philanthropy was as systematic and visionary as his business had been. He did not believe in simple charity, which he felt encouraged dependency. Instead, he sought to create ladders upon which the aspiring can rise. His greatest passion was the creation of free public libraries. Believing that knowledge was the key to self-improvement, he funded the construction of 2,509 libraries throughout the United States, Britain, Canada, and other English-speaking countries, on the condition that the local municipality provide the land and promise to fund the library's ongoing operations. He endowed a dizzying array of institutions dedicated to education, science, and peace. Carnegie Hall in New York, a temple for music; the Carnegie Institute of Pittsburgh, which included a museum, art gallery, and library; the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, D.C. for basic scientific research; the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which created the pension system now known as TIAA-CREF; and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an organization dedicated to the abolition of war. By the time of his death in 1919, he had given away over $350 million, nearly 90% of his fortune. Unlike the other Gilded Age dynasties, there is no Carnegie family empire today. That was by design. Andrew Carnegie had only one child, a daughter Margaret, and he ensured that the vast bulk of his fortune would not be passed down, but would be transformed into a public legacy. The name Carnegie is not attached to a sprawling clan of wealthy descendants, but to the institutions he built. His true heirs are the millions who have walked through the doors of his libraries, the students and teachers supported by his educational foundations, the scientists who have made discoveries in his research institutions, and the audiences who have been moved by the music in his concert hall. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, the last and largest of his endowments, continues his work to this day. The story of Andrew Carnegie is a singular epic, a testament to the fact that the same relentless drive that can conquer an industry and build an empire of steel can also be turned toward the betterment of humanity, creating a legacy not of bloodline, but of opportunity. Before the Vanderbilts had laid a single rail, before Rockefeller had refined a single barrel of oil, another name had already come to define colossal wealth in America: Astor. The Astors were the nation's first great dynasty, the original American plutocrats, whose fortune was built not on industrial might, but on the very land beneath the feet of a growing metropolis. Their story is a 3-act drama, a tale of an ambitious immigrant who conquered the wilderness for its furs, his visionary pivot to the bedrock of Manhattan, and the transformation of his descendants into the imperious, unassailable arbiters of American high society. They were not industrialists. They were the landlords of New York, a family whose power was as solid and as deeply rooted as the island they owned. The epic begins with Johann Jakob Astor, born in 1763 in the humble village of Waldorf, Germany, the son of a butcher. With little prospect at home, the ambitious young man left for London to join his brother, a maker of musical instruments. In 1783, after the end of the American Revolutionary War, he set sail for the new United States, his worldly possessions consisting of a small amount of cash and 7 flutes. A chance encounter on the transatlantic voyage changed his life. A fellow passenger, a fur trader, regaled him with tales of the immense profits to be made buying furs from Native Americans and selling them in London and Europe. Upon arriving in New York, Astor entered the trade. He was a quick study, learning the business from the ground up, first working for others, then trekking into the upstate New York wilderness himself to trade directly with the Iroquois. He was tireless, shrewd, and utterly unsentimental. He learned the quality of pelts, the politics of the frontier, and the art of the deal. He established a small shop in New York City and began to build a network of agents that stretched across the Great Lakes region. His ambition was boundless. In 1808, he consolidated his various ventures into a single powerful entity, the American Fur Company. With the backing of the U.S. government, which was eager to break the dominance of British and Canadian trading companies, Astor created a commercial empire that spanned the continent. His agents were fixtures at military forts and trading posts from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, engaging in a trade that was often brutal, exploitative, and violent. Astor, from his office in New York, was the puppet master, orchestrating this vast, sprawling enterprise with cold, calculating precision. His grandest and most audacious vision was the establishment of a global trading network with a fortified settlement, Astoria, at the mouth of the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. This outpost would buy furs from the interior, trade with China for tea and silks, and ship goods around the world. It was a plan of breathtaking scope, but it was doomed by misfortune. One of his ships, the Tonquin, was destroyed in a violent confrontation with natives. An overland expedition nearly perished in the wilderness. The outbreak of the War of 1812 sealed its fate, forcing Astor to sell the fort to a British rival. It was a bitter failure, but it taught him a valuable lesson about the fickle nature of frontier commerce. Even as his fur empire was at its peak, Astor was executing the most brilliant strategic pivot in American business history. He began to systematically divest from the fur trade and invest his enormous profits in a different commodity, one he believed was far safer and destined for infinite growth: land. Specifically, Manhattan real estate. With an unshakable faith in New York City's destiny, he began buying up vast tracts of what was then farmland, rural estates, and rocky scrubland, all located north of the city's settled boundaries. He bought farms in the area now known as Times Square, purchased coastal land from indebted families, and acquired huge parcels from the city government. People thought he was mad, buying up worthless countryside. But Astor saw what others did not: a city on the verge of explosive growth, an island metropolis hemmed in by water with nowhere to grow but up and north, directly onto his land. He rarely sold. Instead, he leased the land, allowing others to build on it, and then collected the rents, a strategy that guaranteed a perpetual, ever-increasing stream of income. By the time he died in 1848, John Jacob Astor was the richest man in America, his fortune estimated at some $20 million, the vast majority of it in New York real estate. He had transformed the profits of the ephemeral fur trade into a permanent empire of brick, mortar, and land. The second generation, led by his son William Backhouse Astor Sr., was tasked not with creating the fortune, but with consolidating it. Known as the landlord of New York, William B. Astor was a dour, methodical manager who meticulously oversaw the family's holdings. He was not a visionary like his father, but a diligent caretaker who doubled the family fortune through careful management and relentless rent collection, earning a reputation as a notoriously parsimonious landlord. It was under the third and fourth generations, however, that the Astor name became synonymous not just with wealth, but with an almost monarchical social power. The family split into two principal branches, descended from William Sr.'s sons, John Jacob Astor III and William Backhouse Astor the Jr. This split would create a simmering rivalry that played out in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of Fifth Avenue. But the undisputed sovereign of this world was not a man, but a woman, Caroline Lena Schermerhorn Astor, the wife of William Backhouse Astor Jr. The Mrs. Astor, as she insisted on being called, was the absolute arbiter of New York society. In an age of new money and grasping social climbers like the Vanderbilts, Mrs. Astor, a woman of impeccable Dutch and English colonial lineage, represented the old guard. She, along with her social prime minister, the Southern gentleman Ward McAllister, created the infamous 400, a list of the only people deemed socially acceptable in New York. The number was not arbitrary. It was, according to McAllister, the number of people who could comfortably fit into Mrs. Astor's ballroom at her mansion on Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. An invitation to her annual ball was the ultimate validation of one's place in the American elite. To be excluded was to be a social pariah. Mrs. Astor's reign was one of rigid ritual and opulent display. Her life was a series of meticulously planned events, from her summer sojourns in Newport, where she held court in her cottage, Beechwood, to her grand dinners featuring gold-plated service and an army of footmen. Her famous feud with Alva Vanderbilt, who finally forced Mrs. Astor's hand by planning a legendary costume ball and pointedly not inviting Caroline's daughter, is a classic Gilded Age drama. Mrs. Astor ultimately had to swallow her pride and make a formal call on the new money Vanderbilts to secure an invitation for her daughter, a symbolic surrender that signaled the shifting tides of wealth and power. The Astor men of this generation were themselves larger-than-life figures. Mrs. Astor's nephew, William Waldorf Astor, was a bitter rival. In an act of epic social spite, he tore down his own father's mansion, which stood next door to his Aunt Caroline's, and erected the massive 13-story Waldorf Hotel in 1893, deliberately overshadowing her home and disrupting her society parties. Not to be outdone, Mrs. Astor's son, John Jacob Jack Astor IV, persuaded his mother to move further uptown and built the even taller Astoria Hotel on the site of her old mansion in 1897. The two rival hotels were eventually connected by a corridor, creating the iconic Waldorf Astoria, the grandest hotel in the world and the epicenter of New York's social life. William Waldorf, disgusted with what he saw as America's vulgarity, moved to England, purchased Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and became a British subject, eventually being created the first Viscount Astor. Jack Astor IV, who stayed in America, was a quintessential Gilded Age aristocrat, an inventor with several patents to his name, a science fiction author who wrote a novel about a journey to Saturn, a real estate developer, and a war hero from the Spanish-American War. He lived a life of privilege and adventure. His story, and in many ways the Gilded Age itself, came to a dramatic and tragic end on the frigid night of April 15th, 1912. Returning from his honeymoon with his new, much younger, pregnant wife, Madeline, he was a passenger on the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. After the ship struck an iceberg, Jack Astor helped his wife into a lifeboat. When asked if he could join her, he was told, "No women, no children." He stepped back, lit a cigar, and, according to survivors, met his fate with the calm dignity of a gentleman. His body was recovered from the North Atlantic days later, his immense fortune still in his pockets. His death was a global event, a shocking end that symbolized the sinking of an era of seemingly unsinkable power and privilege. The Astor family's legacy in philanthropy is less pronounced than that of their industrialist peers. Their primary contribution was the Astor Library, founded by John Jacob Astor's will, which later merged with other collections to form the core of the magnificent New York Public Library, one of the world's great public institutions. Their true legacy is written on the map of New York City itself, in the name of Astoria, Queens, in Astor Place, and in the enduring glamour of the Waldorf Astoria. Unlike the Carnegies, the Astors sought to perpetuate their fortune through lineage. But the 20th century was not kind to such dynasties. The introduction of income and estate taxes, the Great Depression, and the gradual fragmentation of the real estate empire through inheritance began to erode the family's wealth. The American branch of the family saw its public profile fade, culminating in the sad late-life saga of Brooke Astor, the celebrated philanthropist and third wife of Jack Astor IV's son, Vincent. The legal battles over her estate in her final years cast a shadow over the family's name. The English branch, the descendants of William Waldorf, remain titled and prominent in British society. Today, the Astor name no longer signifies a monolithic financial power, but rather a bygone era of almost feudal control over New York City and a high society whose rigid rules and glittering balls defined the very essence of America's Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age pantheon, where fortunes were forged in steel, oil, and land, the House of Morgan occupied a different, more rarefied plane. The Morgans were not industrialists. They were the architects of industry itself. They did not build railroads. They commanded them. They did not make steel. They created the corporate behemoth that dominated its production. Their currency was not a tangible commodity, but something far more potent: capital, confidence, and control. This was a dynasty not of makers, but of masters, a lineage of financiers culminating in the colossal figure of John Pierpont Morgan, a man who wielded such personal power that he could bring corporations to heel, rescue the United States government from default, and single-handedly halt a financial panic. His story is that of the consolidation of American capitalism, the birth of the modern corporation, and the reign of a private citizen who served as the nation's unofficial central banker. Unlike the rags-to-riches sagas of Carnegie or Astor, the Morgan dynasty began with wealth and respectability. The patriarch was Junius Spencer Morgan, a stern, disciplined New Englander who established the family's formidable presence in the world of international finance. After a successful career as a merchant in Hartford and Boston, Junius made a pivotal move to London in 1854, becoming a partner in the prestigious firm of George Peabody and Company. When Peabody retired, the firm was reborn as J.S. Morgan and Company, a powerful merchant bank that served as a vital bridge for British capital flowing into the rapidly industrializing United States. Junius was a man of unimpeachable integrity, a banker of the old school who believed a man's word was his bond. He financed nations, underwrote industries, and instilled in his son, John Pierpont, the core tenets of the Morgan Creed: an international perspective, an unwavering commitment to stability, and an absolute intolerance for disorderly competition. John Pierpont Morgan, born in 1837, was groomed from birth to inherit this financial empire. Educated in Europe, fluent in French and German, and possessing a formidable mathematical mind, he was sent to New York in 1857 to act as his father's agent. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a gaze of such intensity that it was said to penetrate a man's very soul. His most famous physical characteristic was a chronic skin condition, rhinophyma, which grotesquely enlarged and disfigured his nose, making him intensely sensitive and famously camera-shy. Yet this affliction seemed only to amplify his aura of intimidating power. His early career was not without controversy. During the Civil War, he was embroiled in the Hall Carbine affair, a complex deal in which he provided the financing to purchase 5,000 surplus, defective Army rifles, which were then resold to a Union general at a massive profit. Though his role was that of a lender, the scandal cemented his reputation in some circles as a ruthless war profiteer. But it was in the chaotic aftermath of the war, particularly in the sprawling, cutthroat world of American railroads, that J.P. Morgan found his true calling. The railroad industry was the engine of Gilded Age America, but it was plagued by ruinous competition, overbuilding, and speculative greed. Rival lines engaged in vicious rate wars that drove them to the brink of bankruptcy. Morgan, with his inherited abhorrence of chaos, saw not just a problem, but an opportunity. He developed a process that would become his trademark: Morganization. He would intervene in a failing or warring enterprise, force the competing parties to the negotiating table, and impose a settlement. This was no mere mediation. He would take control, refinancing the company's debt, ruthlessly cutting costs, and installing his own hand-picked men on the board of directors to ensure compliance with the Morgan way. His goal was to replace competition with consolidation, creating stable, profitable, and efficient oligopolies. In 1885, he famously summoned the warring presidents of the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads aboard his steam yacht, the Corsair, and brokered a peace that stabilized freight rates throughout the East. He reorganized countless railroads, including the Albany and Susquehanna, the Chesapeake and Ohio, and the Northern Pacific. By the 1890s, J.P. Morgan was not just a financier of railroads. He was the undisputed master of the industry, controlling a vast network of lines that crisscrossed the nation. His power soon transcended the corporate world, extending to the very finances of the United States government. The panic of 1893 had drained the U.S. Treasury's gold reserves to dangerously low levels, threatening the nation's ability to back its currency and pushing it to the edge of insolvency. In 1895, with the government on the verge of default, President Grover Cleveland had no choice but to turn to the one man with the resources and the credibility to avert disaster: J.P. Morgan. Morgan, in a show of financial force, led a syndicate of American and European bankers to arrange a private bond sale that provided the Treasury with over $60 million in gold, stabilizing the currency and saving the nation's credit. The act made him a hero to some, but to others, particularly populists in the West and South, it was proof of a dangerous conspiracy, a money trust controlled by a single Wall Street banker who held the nation's fate in his hands. As the 19th century drew to a close, Morgan turned his organizing genius from railroads to industry. He financed and engineered the merger of Edison General Electric with its leading competitor to form the industrial giant General Electric in 1892. But his crowning achievement came in 1901. Andrew Carnegie, the King of Steel, was ready to retire and devote his life to philanthropy. At a dinner party hosted by Morgan, Charles M. Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel, outlined a vision for a single, massive steel corporation that would consolidate the entire industry. Morgan, captivated, listened intently. After a brief meeting with Carnegie himself, a deal was struck. Morgan's syndicate bought Carnegie Steel for the astronomical sum of $480 million. He then merged it with his own Federal Steel and other companies to create the United States Steel Corporation. It was the world's first billion-dollar company, a corporate entity of a size and scale previously unimaginable, and it cemented Morgan's status as the master architect of American capitalism. The apex of his power, and its most dramatic demonstration, came during the Panic of 1907. A failed attempt to corner the stock of a copper company triggered a series of bank runs that threatened to collapse the entire American financial system. There was no Federal Reserve, no central bank to act as a lender of last resort. In this vacuum, J.P. Morgan became the central bank. For 2 weeks, the 70-year-old banker took command. From his marble library at Madison Avenue and 36th Street, he summoned the presidents of New York's major banks, the heads of trust companies, and titans of industry. He vetted the books of failing institutions, decided which could be saved and which must be allowed to fail, and directed massive pools of capital to shore up the system. In the most legendary moment of the crisis, he locked the city's leading financiers in his library, refusing to let them leave until, near dawn, they finally agreed to pledge their collective resources to halt the panic. He had, through sheer force of will, saved the economy, but the event also served as a stark warning. The American public and its political leaders realized that the nation's financial stability could not and should not depend on the health and judgment of a single private citizen. The Panic of 1907 led directly to the creation of the Pujol Committee to investigate the money trust, and ultimately to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, the year of Morgan's death. Morgan's personality was as colossal as his influence. He was a man of immense appetites and profound convictions. A devout and active member of the Episcopal Church, he attended its conventions, served as a warden, and generously funded its causes. Yet he was a ruthless capitalist who believed that competition was a sin and consolidation a virtue. He was a devoted family man who also maintained a string of mistresses. He was a titan of finance who sought refuge and solace in the world of art. He was not a philanthropist in the mold of Carnegie or Rockefeller. He did not seek to cure disease or build libraries for the masses. He was, instead, a collector on an imperial scale. With a voracious appetite and a seemingly limitless budget, he acquired masterpieces of painting, sculpture, decorative arts, and, most importantly, rare books and illuminated manuscripts. His collection was a fortress of beauty and history, a personal sanctuary from the vulgarities of the marketplace. Upon his death, his son, J.P. Jack Morgan, Jr., inherited the leadership of the House of Morgan. Jack was a capable banker, but he lacked his father's domineering presence. He ably steered the firm through its role as the primary purchasing agent and financier for the British and French governments during World War I and navigated the turbulent 1920s. But the world had changed. The Pujol Committee's investigation, where J.P. Morgan Sr. had famously testified that character, not collateral, was the basis of credit, signaled the end of an era of unchecked personal power. The true end came with the Great Depression and the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. The law mandated the separation of commercial and investment banking, forcing the mighty House of Morgan to be cleaved in two. J.P. Morgan and Company became a commercial bank, while Morgan Stanley was formed to carry on the investment banking business. This legislative act formally dismantled the integrated financial empire J.P. Morgan had built. The Morgan family's direct personal control over the world of finance ended with Jack. The legacy, however, proved more durable than the dynasty. The greatest gift of the Morgans to the public was the one J.P. Morgan had created for himself. In 1924, Jack Morgan, honoring his father's wishes, transformed the private library into a public institution, the Morgan Library and Museum. It remains one of the world's finest treasuries of art, literature, and music, a testament to a collector whose passion was as immense as his financial power. In the corporate world, the Morgan name not only survived but thrived. The successor firms, J.P. Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley, have evolved into two of the most powerful and influential financial institutions on the planet. The Morgan dynasty, as a family enterprise, has faded into history, its wealth dispersed among descendants. But the legacy of its founder, a legacy of consolidation, of financial architecture, and of a belief in centralized power, is embedded in the DNA of the global corporate system he helped to create. Deeply rooted in the soil of the Brandywine Valley in Delaware, the story of the DuPont family unfolds unlike any other Gilded Age saga. This was not a dynasty built by a single ruthless tycoon, but a clannish, almost feudal enterprise nurtured across generations. For over 2 centuries, the DuPonts have been a force in American industry, beginning with a vital and dangerous commodity, gunpowder, and transforming their enterprise into a chemical empire that would invent the very materials of the modern world. Theirs is a story of aristocratic French origins, of revolutionary science, of bitter family feuds, and of an enduring paternalistic influence over their home state, a relationship so profound that for much of its history, Delaware was often referred to as the DuPont Company state. The dynasty's founder was Eleuthère Irénée Dupont de Nemours, a man of science and breeding who was born in Paris in 1771. His father, Pierre Samuel Dupont, was a prominent intellectual, economist, and minor nobleman who narrowly escaped the guillotine during the French Revolution's reign of terror. Eleuthère Irénée, or Ahai as he became known, was a student of the celebrated chemist Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, from whom he learned the precise art of gunpowder manufacturing. In 1800, fleeing the political instability of Napoleonic France, the entire DuPont clan set sail for America, a land of refuge and opportunity. Soon after arriving, EY, an avid hunter, was struck by the poor quality and high price of American-made gunpowder. He saw a market niche that his unique skills could fill. With capital raised in France, he returned to the New World, and in 1802 purchased a tract of land on the banks of the Brandywine Creek, just outside Wilmington, Delaware. There he established his powder works, A.E. Dupont de Nemours and Company. From its inception, the company was a family affair. E.I. built his home, Eleutherian Mills, overlooking the powder yards. He and his descendants would create a sprawling family compound along the creek, a self-contained community where generations of DuPonts lived, worked, and all too often died together. The gunpowder business was perilous. Devastating explosions were a constant threat, and the family's early history is punctuated by tragedy. An explosion in 1818 killed 40 workers and gravely injured EY's wife, Sophie. The family patriarchs adopted a deeply paternalistic attitude, building homes, schools, and churches for their workers and providing pensions for the widows and orphans of those killed in the mills. This created a fierce loyalty, but also a rigid hierarchical social structure. The company grew steadily, its fortunes tied to the expansion of the nation. DuPont became the primary and most reliable supplier of high-quality explosives to the United States military, playing a crucial role in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and most significantly, the Civil War, during which the DuPont black powder mills supplied nearly half of the Union Army's gunpowder. Throughout the 19th century, the company also ruthlessly consolidated its power, forming the Gunpowder Trust that squeezed out competitors and established a near monopoly on the American explosives market. The dawn of the 20th century brought the dynasty to a crisis point. In 1902, the company's president, Eugene DuPont, died unexpectedly. The elder generation of the family, lacking a clear successor, decided the best course of action was to sell the company to its largest rival. This decision horrified three young cousins who believed the company's best days were ahead of it. This trio, Alfred Vasseur DuPont, the brilliant but tempestuous engineer, T. Coleman DuPont, the charismatic, politically ambitious salesman, and Pierre S. DuPont, the quiet, strategic, and financial genius, would stage a coup that not only saved the family business, but utterly transformed it. In a bold and complex move, they orchestrated a leveraged buyout, taking control of the company from their own relatives. They immediately set about modernizing the sprawling enterprise, establishing one of the country's first centralized research and development laboratories, and beginning a strategic diversification away from the company's reliance on explosives. World War I was the catalyst that propelled DuPont into the modern era. As the primary munitions supplier to the Allied forces, the company's profits skyrocketed, generating an enormous cash surplus. Pierre S. DuPont, the visionary strategist of the trio, knew that this wartime boom was temporary. He began to steer the company's massive resources toward a new frontier, the emerging science of polymer chemistry. The company's new motto became, "Better things for better living," through chemistry. The research and development labs that Pierre had championed began to produce a stunning array of revolutionary new materials that would reshape daily life. Cellophane, the first truly clear and flexible packaging, fast-drying Duco paint, which revolutionized the automobile industry, and, most famously, nylon, the world's first fully synthetic fiber, which debuted at the 1939 New York World's Fair and created a consumer frenzy. In the decades that followed, DuPont would introduce a host of other iconic products, including Teflon, Lycra, Kevlar, and Tyvek. The company that had armed a nation for war was now clothing it, packaging its food, and building its homes. The cousins' partnership, while brilliantly successful, was not immune to the family's penchant for drama. Alfred I DuPont, the engineering genius, fell from grace after a scandalous divorce and a subsequent marriage to a divorced cousin, which violated the family's rigid social code. Ousted from the company's leadership by Pierre, Alfred moved to Florida, where he built a second financial empire in banking and real estate and dedicated his fortune to creating the Nemours Foundation, a vast pediatric health system. The most consequential of Pierre's ventures, however, was his investment in the fledgling automobile industry. In 1914, he began investing in a struggling car company called General Motors. By 1920, with GM on the brink of collapse, DuPont invested millions, taking control of the company. He installed one of his top executives, the legendary Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., as GM's president. Under Sloan's management, and with DuPont's financial backing, General Motors was reorganized and transformed into the world's largest corporation, eventually surpassing Ford. The spectacular success of GM made the DuPont family one of the wealthiest in America, their fortune no longer just from gunpowder, but from the defining product of the 20th century, the automobile. The DuPont's wealth and influence were most acutely felt in their home state. They dominated Delaware's economy and its politics. Pierre S. DuPont, a quiet and intensely private man, used his personal fortune to completely overhaul the state's public education system, building modern schools for white and black children alike. The family's philanthropy was deeply tied to their heritage and their love of the Brandywine Valley. Pierre's magnum opus is Longwood Gardens, which he transformed from a simple country arboretum into one of the world's most magnificent horticultural displays, a dazzling spectacle of fountains, conservatories, and gardens that he left as a public trust for all to enjoy. His cousin, Henry Francis DuPont, created the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library, the world's premier collection of American decorative arts. And Alfred's Nemours estate, a French-style chateau and garden, is now home to the renowned Nemours Children's Hospital. The Brandywine Valley is, in effect, a living museum to the DuPont family's wealth, taste, and civic legacy. The decline of the DuPonts as a ruling dynasty was a slow, gradual process of dilution and regulation. Their immense power attracted government scrutiny, culminating in a 1957 Supreme Court antitrust ruling that forced DuPont to divest its 23% stake in General Motors. This was a significant blow to the family's centralized financial power. Moreover, the family itself simply grew too large. E.I. DuPont had many children, and subsequent generations were equally prolific. Today, the DuPont clan numbers in the thousands. While the family, as a whole, remains one of the wealthiest in the nation, the fortune is now spread so widely that few individual members possess the influence of their ancestors. Direct family control of the DuPont Company has waned, and the corporation itself has undergone massive transformations in the 21st century, including a historic merger with its rival Dow Chemical. The modern legacy of the DuPonts is therefore a complex tapestry. It lives on in the global corporation that still bears their name, in the revolutionary materials that are woven into the fabric of everyday life, and in the magnificent gardens and museums that grace the Delaware landscape. But it also exists in the sprawling, private, and now largely anonymous family, a dynasty whose story arc spans from the court of Louis XVI to the battlefields of the Civil War, from the explosive power of gunpowder to the synthetic wonders of the chemical age, a testament to an enduring and uniquely American aristocratic legacy. The great dynasties of the Gilded Age forged modern America, their personal empires of industry and finance eventually transforming into the enduring institutions we know today. Their names are now history, but the questions they raise about ambition, wealth, and legacy are timeless. What are your thoughts on their monumental impact? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy our channel, please make sure to like and subscribe.